I'm Aramin to Reed, 78, a woman, and I just discovered that for the last 5 years I haven't been a grandmother. I've been a personal ATM. The realization didn't come like a sudden clap of thunder. It was more like the slow, creeping chill of a window left open in winter, a draft you ignore for ages until you finally notice you're frozen to the bone. For years, I had mistaken my granddaughter's dependence for affection, her requests for need, her presence for love. I was wrong on all counts, and the truth, when it finally revealed itself, was as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass in the heart. My life before this chilling discovery was one of quiet routine. I live in the same house my late husband, Robert, and I bought 50 years ago. It's a sturdy brick colonial on a street lined with oak trees that are even older than I am. The rooms are filled with memories, the scuff marks on the baseboards from our daughter Sarah's roller skates, the faint scent of Robert's pipe tobacco that still clings to the leather of his favorite armchair, the mantelpiece crowded with photographs of a life well lived. Since Robert passed on 8 years ago, the silence in these rooms has grown louder, the memories more poignant. My world had shrunk, as worlds often do with age, and its brightest, most vibrant point of light was my granddaughter, Chloe. Chloe is Sarah's only child. Sarah and her husband moved to Oregon when Chloe was in high school, and while we spoke on the phone every Sunday, the distance was a constant, dull ache. Chloe, however, had stayed on the East Coast for college, just a 2-hour drive away. After Robert died, she became my anchor. She would visit on weekends, her youthful energy a welcome storm in the quiet house. She'd fill me in on her classes, her friends, her dreams of becoming a digital artist and content creator, a world I didn't quite understand but supported with the blind faith of a loving grandmother. The financial support started small. It was after her college graduation. She was trying to build her brand, she explained, and the gig economy was tough. It's all about the aesthetic, Graham, she'd say, her eyes wide and earnest. You have to project success to attract success. It began with me covering her rent so she could focus on her portfolio instead of waiting tables. It felt right. Robert had left me more than comfortable, and what good was money if it couldn't help the person you loved most in the world? Robert, bless his practical soul, had always been more cautious. Minta, he used to say, his hand covering mine, love is not a blank check, don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. I had dismissed his worries as the gentle grumbling of a man from a different generation, a man who believed in bootstraps and hard work above all else. I believed in giving my granddaughter a safety net, a foundation from which she could soar. The first test of that foundation came about a year into this arrangement. Chloe called me, her voice a carefully constructed whisper of distress. She had a chance to collaborate with a major fashion influencer, she said, but she couldn't possibly show up with her old, scuffed handbag. She needed a particular vintage designer bag, one that would signal she belonged in that world. She sent me a link. The price made my breath catch in my throat. It was more than the mortgage payments on this house used to be. But the thought of her missing an opportunity, of her feeling small or inadequate, was worse. I transferred the money. A week later, I saw a picture she posted online. She was at a brunch spot with friends, the expensive bag sitting on the table next to a mimosa. There was no mention of a collaboration. When I asked, she was vague. Oh, it got postponed, Graham. It's all about networking, you know. I chose to believe her. The second incident was the laptop. She called me in a panic. Graham, it's a catastrophe. My laptop just died, completely fried, and my final project for the big design competition is on it. The deadline is in 3 days. The image of her hard work vanishing into the digital ether was horrifying. I didn't hesitate. I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought her the most powerful, most expensive laptop they had. It was a sleek silver machine that cost more than my first car. I delivered it to her myself, and she hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack. You're my savior, she whispered. 3 weeks later, I was helping her clean out her car before she took it to the mechanic, and tucked under a blanket on the back seat was her old laptop. I opened it. The screen flickered to life, showing her social media page. It worked perfectly. When I looked at her, she just shrugged. Oh yeah, it started working again. So weird, right? But this new one is so much faster. It's really elevated my content. She smiled, a bright, guileless smile, and I felt a strange, cold knot tighten in my stomach. I told myself it was just yout. H-fall carelessness, I ignored the knot. The final and most significant escalation began when she introduced me to Derek. He was her new boyfriend, a man with a smile that was too quick and eyes that never seemed to fully meet mine. He was handsome, I suppose, in a slick, modern way, and he laid the charm on thick. He called me Mrs. Reed, complimented my home, my baking, my stories of the old days. But all the while, he held Chloe's hand in a way that seemed less like affection and more like ownership. After Derek arrived, Chloe's needs became more sophisticated. They were no longer about simple support, they were investments. Graham, Derek has this incredible idea for a startup, she'd explain, her voice buzzing with borrowed enthusiasm. We just need some seed money to get the website built. Or Derek thinks I should rebrand. We need to rent a professional studio for a photo shoot to get some high-quality images for my portfolio. It's an investment in my future career. Each request was larger than the last. Rent for a new, more expensive apartment in a trendier part of the city. A new car because her old one wasn't reliable for client meetings. I paid for it all. I was investing in my granddaughter, in her happiness, in the future she was building with this man who seemed to adore her. Every time I wrote a check or made a transfer, a faint echo of Robert's voice would whisper in my mind. Love is not a blank check, Minta. I would push it away, telling his photograph on the mantelpiece, oh, Robert, you don't understand. The world is different now. It's harder for young people. But the knot in my stomach was growing, turning from a small, cold pebble into a heavy stone. I was funding a life that I was beginning to realize I knew nothing about. The smiling pictures online, the brunch spots, the weekend trips they took, they were all courtesy of my husband's hard-earned money. And I was starting to wonder if I was building a foundation or digging a hole. The unease that had been a quiet hum in the back of my mind began to grow into a dissonant thrum. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, a sense of things being slightly off-key, like a familiar song played in the wrong register. It happened in small moments, a flicker in Chloe's eyes, a comment from Derek that was a little too smooth, a little too practiced. The storm was gathering, and I, fool that I was, stood in the open field, telling myself it was only a passing cloud. They visited one Sunday afternoon in late spring. The air was warm, and the scent of the peonies blooming in my garden drifted through the open windows. I had spent the morning baking a coffee cake, their favorite. They swept in with the casual flurry that always accompanied them, bringing a gust of the outside world into my quiet home. Chloe was wearing a dress that was artfully ripped at the seams, a style I would never comprehend, and Derek had on a pair of sunglasses perched on his head despite being indoors. Graham, this smells amazing, Chloe said, kissing the air beside my cheek before making a beeline for the cake on the kitchen counter. Araminta, you are a treasure. An absolute national treasure, Derek added, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. His compliments were like his smile, perfectly formed but lacking any real warmth. They felt like lines he had rehearsed. We sat in the living room, making small talk. They spoke of their week, of friends I didn't know and parties I couldn't imagine. Then, as if on cue, they brought up the new apartment. We found the most incredible place, Graham, Chloe began, her voice taking on that dreamy quality she used when she was about to ask for something. It's a loft, really spacious, with these huge north-facing windows. The light is just perfect. For my content creation, it would be a total game changer. Derek nodded eagerly. It's a professional space, Araminta. It would legitimize her brand. People would see that apartment in her videos and know she's serious. It's an investment, pure and simple. There was that word again, investment. It was the shield they held up to deflect any scrutiny, the magic word that was meant to turn a blatant request for money into a savvy business decision. I felt a prickle of something that was not quite annoyance, but a weary sort of fatigue. I decided to test the waters gently. That sounds lovely, dear, I said, trying to keep my voice even. And how is the job search going? Have you had any luck finding something stable to supplement your art? The shift in the room was instantaneous. The light, breezy atmosphere evaporated. Chloe's smile tightened at the edges. Graham, we've talked about this, she said, her tone suddenly sharp. A 9 to 5 would kill my creativity. I can't be boxed in like that. I thought you understood my journey. She's an artist, Araminta, Derek chimed in, his voice a smooth, placating balm intended to soothe the waters he had helped to stir. Why? Zoe can't put a visionary on a factory line. Chloe is building an empire, and you're the foundational investor. It's something to be proud of. He smiled at me as if he had just bestowed upon me a great honor. I looked at my granddaughter at the defensive set of her jaw and I saw a stranger. My question hadn't been an attack, it had been a grandmother's gentle, practical concern, but she had heard it as a criticism, as a lack of faith. Or worse, she had seen it as a threat to the comfortable arrangement she had built for herself. The conversation faltered after that. They finished their cake quickly, their praise for it now feeling forced and hollow. They made their excuses, a friend they had to meet, an appointment they had forgotten, and soon they were gone, leaving a silence in their wake that was heavier than before. I sat in Robert's armchair for a long time after they left, the plate with the leftover crumbs of cake on the side table. I felt managed. I felt as though I had just sat through a carefully orchestrated performance designed to plant a seed that they would expect me to water with my money. Their visit hadn't felt like a family gathering. It felt like a pitch meeting. The loneliness of the house, usually a quiet companion, felt immense and suffocating that afternoon. I walked from room to room, touching the frames of the photographs. Robert smiling on a beach in Cape Cod. Sarah, age 7, missing her 2 front teeth. Chloe as a baby, a bundle of soft blankets in my arms. Where was that child? Where was the girl who would fall asleep in my lap, who drew me pictures with crayons, who told me she loved me without a single thought of what she might get in return? I was funding the life of a 25-year-old woman, but I was beginning to fear that I had lost my granddaughter somewhere along the way. The gathering storm was no longer on the horizon. I could feel the drop in pressure, the electric charge in the air. I just didn't know that the lightning was about to strike me directly. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because the gardeners came on Tuesdays and the scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air, a scent I'd always associated with simple domestic peace. That peace was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The day before, I had spoken to Chloe on the phone. Her voice had a strained, unhappy edge to it. She complained about a creative block, about the pressures of social media, about how Derek was stressed about their finances. It was the usual prelude, the soft music that played before the curtain rose on the main performance of asking for money. In that moment, however, all I heard was my granddaughter's unhappiness. My heart went out to her. To cheer her up, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a while. I would bake her favorite cake, a lemon drizzle loaf with extra icing, and drive it over to her apartment as a surprise. The whole time I was mixing the batter, zesting the lemons, and watching the cake turn a perfect golden brown in the oven, I felt a sense of purpose. This was what grandmothers did. They offered comfort in the form of sugar and butter. They showed their love through simple, tangible acts. I carefully placed the warm loaf into a cake box, tied it with a pretty blue ribbon, and set off on the 2-hour drive, imagining the look of surprise and delight on her face. I arrived at her apartment building in the late afternoon. It was a trendy, modern building with lots of glass and steel, the kind of place that prided itself on being exclusive. I took the elevator up to the 4th floor, the cake box held carefully in my hands. As I walked down the hallway, I could already hear her voice from inside her apartment. It seemed the door was slightly ajar, not fully latched. I smiled to myself. She must have been on the phone. I raised my hand to knock, to call out a cheerful surprise, but something in the tone of her voice made me pause. It wasn't the strained, sad voice from yesterday. This voice was animated, alive, and sharp-edged with a kind of derisive humor that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. "I'm telling you, it was unreal," I heard her say, followed by a short, sharp laugh. I froze, my hand hovering in midair. It felt wrong to eavesdrop, but I was rooted to the spot, a sudden, cold dread washing over me. "She was at it again on Sunday," Chloe continued, and I knew with a sickening certainty that she was talking about me, poking her nose in, asking all these questions about my job search like she has any idea what my life is like. "Have you had any luck finding something stable?" she says in that little quavering, concerned voice of hers. She mimicked my voice on that last part, twisting it into a pathetic, feeble caricature. The sound of it was a small, sharp slap. I could hear the faint, indistinct murmur of a man's voice on the other end of the line. "Derek. It had to be." Chloe laughed again, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "I know, right? Honestly, Derek, I don't know how much longer I can play the sweet, grateful granddaughter role. It's exhausting. She's just this bitter, lonely old hag who sits in that mausoleum of a house all day, probably just rereading my dad's old letters or whatever. It's pathetic." Bitter, lonely, old hag. The words didn't just register in my mind, they landed physically. I felt my breath hitch, a sharp, painful gasp. My heart, which had been beating with happy anticipation just moments before, seemed to stop altogether. It was as if the world had suddenly gone silent, all sound sucked into a vacuum, leaving only her voice, sharp and cruel, echoing in the void. And then came the final, killing blow. "But hey," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, gleeful tone. "Thank God her only purpose in life is funding our lifestyle. She's the best personal ATM a girl could ask for. All I have to do is cry a little on the phone, and boom, the deposit for the new loft is as good as ours." A personal ATM. The cake box, which I had been holding so carefully, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My fingers went numb and it slipped, tumbling to the carpeted hallway floor with a soft, dull thud. The lid popped open, revealing the perfect lemon drizzle cake, now slightly crushed on one side. The sweet scent of lemon and sugar filled the air, a sickeningly wholesome aroma in a moment of such profound ugliness. I didn't make a sound, I couldn't. The world was tilting on its axis. The woman on the other side of that door was not my granddaughter. She was a predator and I was her prey. Every act of love, every gesture of support, every dollar I had given her was not a gift, but a transaction. I wasn't her grandmother. I was a resource to be managed, a fool to be exploited. Robert's warnings, his gentle admonitions, "Love is not a blank check, Minta," came crashing down on me not as a memory, but as a prophecy I had willfully ignored. I turned, my movements stiff and robotic, like an old automaton winding down. I bent over, my back screaming in protest, and picked up the cake box. I closed the lid on the ruined cake, a perfect metaphor for my ruined love. I walked back to the elevator, my footsteps silent. In the mirrored walls of the elevator car, I saw the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth a thin, bloodless line. She looked old. She looked lonely. She looked like a fool. The 2-hour drive home passed in a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the roads. I remember the cake box sitting on the passenger seat next to me, a silent, mocking testament to my naivety. When I finally pulled into my own garage, I turned off the engine and just sat there in the sudden, deafening silence. The words echoed and echoed in my head. Lonely old hag, personal ATM. A great, shuddering sob tore through me, a sound of such raw agony it felt like it was being ripped from my soul. I had gone to my granddaughter's home to give her a gift, and in return she had given me the truth. And the truth was a poison. The days that followed were gray. Not just the sky, which seemed to be in a perpetual state of overcast gloom, but everything. The colors in my house seemed muted, the taste of my food was bland, the melodies of my favorite classical music pieces were just noise. I was living in the wreckage of the woman I used to be, surrounded by the ghosts of a love I now knew to be a lie. My grief was a physical presence, a heavy shroud that smothered me day and night. I didn't call Chloe, I didn't answer when she called me. My phone, once a lifeline to the person I loved most, became an instrument of torment. I would watch it light up with her name, my heart giving a painful lurch every time, and I would let it ring until it fell silent. The first few texts were casual, almost breezy. "Hey Graham, just checking in, hope you're having a good week. Zoxo." I stared at the Zoxo, the casual sign-off of affection, and felt a wave of nausea. It was a currency she was used to spending, a cheap and meaningless token. I deleted the message. After a few days, when the automatic payment for her rent and her generous weekly allowance failed to appear in her bank account, the tone of the messages began to shift. The breeziness was replaced by a thread of confusion. "Hey Graham, is everything okay? I haven't heard from you. Give me a call when you get this." And then, a day later, "Graham, did you forget to make the transfer? The rent is due tomorrow. My landlord is a real stickler about it. Please call me." I read the words and felt a cold, hard anger begin to form beneath the layers of my grief. My landlord, not our landlord. The pretense that she was in any way responsible for her own life was so deeply ingrained that she didn't even notice it. I remained silent. My silence was a wall, the first I had ever built between us. And as the days passed, she began to throw herself aga. Instant, her confusion curdling into entitlement, and then, finally, into outright anger. Evelyn, what is going on? I'm going to get hit with a late fee because of you. This is really messing things up for me and Derek. You can't just do this without any explanation. Pick up the phone. She had never, not once in her entire life, called me by my first name. It was always Gram or Grandma. Hearing Araminta from her, especially in a text message dripping with petulant rage, was another small death. It was the final stripping away of our familial bond, leaving only the raw, transactional nature of our relationship exposed. She wasn't yelling at her grandmother. She was yelling at a faulty machine that had failed to dispense her cash. I spent my days aimlessly wandering the house. Every object was a trigger: the photograph of a smiling Chloe at her high school graduation, an event for which I had bought her a car. The small, lopsided clay pot she made for me in summer camp when she was 10, a pot I had treasured for its imperfection. Was any of it real? Had she ever loved me? Or had I simply been the person who paid for things, the reliable source of funds from the very beginning? The words she had spoken to Derek played on a continuous, torturous loop in my mind. Lonely old hag. I'd catch my reflection in a window and flinch. Was that what I was? Had my quiet life, my widowhood, my devotion to her all curdled into a pathetic caricature that she could so easily mock? The loneliness she had sneered at was now my reality, a vast, echoing cavern inside me. Her words had not only described my state, they had created it. I had been lonely before, but it was a gentle melancholy. Now it was an acute, stabbing pain. I felt like a fool, duped and discarded. The shame of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. My love had been used as a weapon against me, and my generosity had been my undoing. One evening, I found myself sitting in Robert's armchair, staring at the phone as it lit up with another call from Chloe. After the sixth ring, it stopped. A moment later, a new text message appeared. Fine, be that way. I hope you're happy being all alone in that big, empty house. Derek and I will figure it out. We always do. Don't expect to hear from me again. It was a threat disguised as a farewell, a final attempt at manipulation. See what you're losing, see how you'll be all alone. A month ago, that message would have shattered me. It would have sent me scrambling for the phone, for my checkbook, desperate to repair the breach, to buy back her affection. But now something inside me had broken and begun to reset, like a bone healing stronger than before. The wall of my silence held. I read the message, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't feel grief or shame. I felt nothing at all, and in that emptiness there was a strange, terrifying, and liberating sense of peace. The storm of her demands had passed. Now I was left in the quiet aftermath, and I knew I could not stay in the wreckage forever. I had to find a way to rebuild. The numbness eventually gave way to a cold, hard resolve. I could not spend the rest of my years marinating in this sorrow, a prisoner in my own home, haunted by the ghost of a granddaughter who never really existed. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but alongside it, a new feeling was taking root, a steely determination. I had been a victim, I would not remain one. But I knew, with the kind of clarity that comes only after a profound shock, that I could not do this alone. I needed an ally. I needed someone who saw the world not through a haze of affection and hope, but in stark, unforgiving black and white. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. It was answered on the second ring. Arthur Finch. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, crisp, no nonsense, and carrying the dry authority of a man who had spent 45 years practicing law. Arthur, I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy to my ears. It's Araminta Reed. There was a brief pause, and then his tone softened immediately. Araminta, it's good to hear your voice. Is everything all right? The simple, genuine concern in his question was almost my undoing. I had to press my lips together to keep a sob from escaping. Not exactly, Arthur, I managed to say. I need your help. I need to see you. It's about my finances. It's about Chloe. I'll be there tomorrow at 10, he said without hesitation. You just sit tight. Arthur Finch had been my husband's best friend since they were boys. He was the executor of Robert's will, our family lawyer, and a man whose integrity was as solid as the granite courthouse downtown. He was sharp, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal. While I had been the heart of my marriage with Robert, Arthur had always been the designated spine, and right now I needed a spine more than anything. The next morning, he arrived precisely at 10, carrying an old leather briefcase that looked as distinguished and experienced as he did. He was a tall, lean man with a full head of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted me with a brief, comforting hug and followed me into the living room. I had rehearsed what I would say, but when I sat down across from him, the words caught in my throat. I started and stopped, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the unexplainable. Finally, I just took a deep breath and told him everything, starting with the overheard conversation at Chloe's apartment. I repeated the words, lonely old hag, personal ATM, and saw a flicker of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a quiet, simmering anger on my behalf. He listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, not interrupting once. When I was finished, the whole sordid tale of the last 5 years laid bare between us, he was silent for a long moment. Araminta, he said finally, his voice low and firm. Robert always worried about this. He saw the entitlement in her when she was just a teenager. He told me once that girl sees Araminta's love as an entitlement, not a gift. I wish to God he hadn't been so right. He shook his head slowly. Well, he's not here to fix it, so we're going to fix it right now. His decisiveness was a balm to my wounded spirit. He moved from friend to lawyer in an instant. First things first, he said, opening his briefcase. This is not a family squabble. Let's call it what it is, financial exploitation of an elder. It's ugly, but we need to be clear about it. Now I need you to gather every piece of evidence you have. Bank statements, credit card bills, any emails or records of transfers you can find. I want to see a full accounting of the last 5 years. It took me the better part of an hour to collect the stacks of paper from my office. Laying them out on the dining room table was a sobering, horrifying experience. With Arthur guiding me, we went through them, line by line, highlighting every transfer to Chloe, every bill paid on her behalf, every extravagant purchase. Seeing the numbers all together in cold, hard, black and white print was a second, more profound shock. The designer handbag, the top-of-the-line laptop, the down payment on her car, the rent month after month, the weekly allowances that were more than many people's salaries, the seed money for Derek's phantom startups. It was a staggering sum, an amount that could have funded a dozen college educations or supported a small charity for a decade. I had bled money for 5 years, and I hadn't even realized the extent of the wound. I stared at the final tally Arthur had calculated, my hands trembling. I was such a fool, I whispered, the shame washing over me again. No, Arthur said, his voice sharp, cutting through my self-pity. You were not a fool, you were a grandmother, you were loving and you were trusting. She is the one who chose to exploit that love. The shame belongs to her and her alone. Our job now is not to wallow in it, but to make sure it can never, ever happen again. And so we formulated a plan. It wasn't about revenge. Arthur was very clear on that. Revenge was messy and emotionally draining. This was about protection. This was about consequences. First, we would establish an irrevocable trust. All of my major assets, the house, the investment portfolio Robert had so carefully built, would be placed into it. I would be the beneficiary, of course, drawing a generous income for the rest of my life, but I would no longer be the sole trustee with unilateral control. Arthur's firm would be the co-trustee. Any major unscheduled disbursement would require his signature. The ATM, as Chloe had so crudely put it, would be officially out of service. Second, we would draw up a new will. The previous one had left the bulk of my estate to Chloe. The new one would be drastically different. My daughter, Sarah, would receive a significant portion, but Chloe's inheritance would be conditional. It would be held in trust, and she wouldn't see a single penny of it until she met a series of strict, legally binding requirements. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of strength returned. I was no longer just a passive victim of a cruel betrayal. I was taking action. I was building a fortress not of silence but of legal and financial prudence. With every document Arthur prepared, with every signature I made, I felt another stone being laid in that wall. The plan was in place. All that was left was the inevitable confrontation. I dreaded it, but I also knew it was necessary. It was the final chapter of my old life, and the first chapter of my new one. A week later they came. I knew they would. Desperation is a powerful motivator. It was a Thursday evening just after dusk. The doorbell rang, a shrill, impatient sound that sliced through the quiet of the house. I looked through the peephole and saw them standing. Then my porch silhouetted against the fading light. Chloe and Derek, their faces tight with anxiety and anger. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I straightened my shoulders, walked to the door, and opened it. "We need to talk," Chloe said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. Derek followed, his eyes darting around the room as if he were assessing what he stood to lose. "Yes," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "I believe we do." I led them into the living room, the same room where they had spun their lies and pitched their investments just a few weeks before. I remained standing, a silent signal that this was not a social visit. On the coffee table between us sat a single, closed manila folder. Chloe began, her voice quivering with expertly crafted emotion. She tried tears first. "Graham, what did I do? Why are you doing this to me, to us? I've been calling and texting. I've been so worried, and you just cut me off without a word. It's so cruel." Derek stepped forward, playing the role of the concerned, reasonable partner. "Araminta, we're really worried about you, but we're also in a terrible position here. Chloe could be homeless. Her career, everything we've been building, it's all at risk. We don't understand why you're punishing her like this." I listened to their performance and I felt nothing but a profound, weary clarity. The masks they wore were so transparent to me now. It was like watching a play for the second time. You know all the lines, you see all the tricks. When it was clear that their performance of wounded concern wasn't working, their tone shifted. The manufactured tears dried up and the entitlement broke through, raw and ugly. "You can't just do this." Chloe's voice rose, cracking with frustration. "My entire life is built around your support. You always promised you would take care of me." "She's right, Araminta," Derek added, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "You have a responsibility to her. You can't just pull the rug out from under us like this." That was my cue. I had dreaded this moment, but now that it was here, I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. I looked directly at Chloe, my gaze unwavering. "I didn't just do this, Chloe," I said, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You did. I was at your apartment a few weeks ago. I brought you a cake. The door was open." I watched the color drain from her face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Derek looked from her to me, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "I heard you on the phone with Derek," I continued, my voice steady, relentless. "I heard everything. I heard you mimicking my voice. I heard you complain about having to play the sweet granddaughter role. And I heard you call me what was it again? Oh yes, a bitter, lonely old hag whose only purpose was to be your personal ATM. I let the words hang in the air between us, heavy and toxic. Chloe stared at me, her face a mask of horror. She tried to stammer out a denial, a pathetic string of "No, I didn't, you misunderstood." "There was no misunderstanding, Chloe," I said, cutting her off. I reached for the manila folder on the table and opened it. For 5 years, I thought I was supporting my granddaughter's dream. It turns out I was funding a lie. I slid the top sheet of paper across the table towards them. It was the final tally that Arthur had prepared, the grand total of every dollar I had given them. It was a number with a lot of zeros. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is what your dream has cost me. This is the price of your brunch dates, your designer clothes, your trendy apartments, and Derek's imaginary businesses." Derek looked at the number and paled. Chloe just stared, speechless. "The ATM is closed," I told them, my voice devoid of emotion. "Permanently. As of yesterday, all of my significant assets have been placed into an irrevocable trust. My friend and lawyer Arthur Finch is the co-trustee. Nothing gets dispersed without his signature, and I assure you he is significantly less sentimental than I am." I then slid a second document across the table. "This is a summary of my new will. Your name is still in it, Chloe, but your inheritance is now conditional. It will be held in trust until and only until you meet certain requirements." I let them read it, get a full-time, verifiable job, and hold it for a minimum of 3 consecutive years. Complete a certified financial literacy course. Attend 1 year of weekly therapy sessions with a licensed professional. And finally, write me a formal, notarized letter detailing why your actions were wrong. Chloe's head shot up, her eyes blazing with disbelief and fury. The mask didn't just fall, it shattered. You're insane, she shrieked, her voice raw. This is a joke, you're a cruel, controlling monster. After everything I've done for you, all the time I spent with you, listen. A end to your boring stories. A vindictive old woman, that's what you are. Derek snarled, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. You'd rather let your money rot in a bank than help your own family. I see now why your husband died. He probably couldn't stand to be around you anymore. The cruelty of his final remark was breathtaking, but it didn't pierce the armor I now wore. It was just the flailing of a parasite being starved of its host. It was meaningless. I simply looked at them at their true, unveiled selves. I think you should both leave now, I said quietly. They hurled a few more insults as they stormed towards the door, their rage echoing in the foyer. Then the front door slammed shut with a shuddering finality. And in the silence that followed, I did not feel lonely. I did not feel bitter. I felt the first true, clean breath of freedom I had taken in 5 years. The house was quiet, but it was no longer an empty quiet. It was a peaceful one. It was mine again. In the weeks following the confrontation, the silence from Chloe was absolute. There were no more calls, no more texts filled with vitriol or manipulative pleading. It was as if a constant, grating noise I had lived with for years had finally been switched off. The quiet was a relief, a deep and profound peace that settled into the corners of my home and my heart. I had expected to feel a lingering sadness, a sense of loss for the granddaughter I once loved, and in some quiet moments a phantom of that grief would surface, but it was fleeting. The raw, vicious truth of who she had become had, in a strange way, cauterized the wound. It's hard to mourn someone who never really existed. The girl I loved was a fiction I had co-authored, and the real author had written a very different final act. With Arthur's guidance, I began to truly assess my life and my finances. Freed from the constant drain of Chloe's demands, I realized the extent of the resources Robert had left me. It was a considerable fortune, one I had viewed merely as a safety net, but which Chloe had seen as an endless buffet. Now I saw it for what it truly was, a tool, a potential for good that had been horribly misused. I could have hoarded it. I could have let it sit in trusts and accounts, gaining interest, a monument to my newfound security. But what would be the point? To die as the richest woman in the cemetery? Robert had worked hard his entire life, not so his legacy could be squandered by an entitled brat, but also not so it could be locked away in a vault. He believed in building things. He believed in potential. The idea came to me one morning as I was tending to the roses in my garden. Chloe had always claimed to be an artist, a creator. It was a lie, a costume she wore, but there were real ones out there. Young, talented, passionate people who were genuinely struggling, who were waiting tables and driving for rideshare companies to support their real work, not to fund a lifestyle of brunches and designer bags. A month later, with Arthur handling the legal complexities, the Robert Reed Foundation for Aspiring Artisans was born. It was a small, local foundation with a simple mission: to provide modest, no-strings-attached grants to young artists, artisans, and craftspeople in our state. We weren't looking for influencers or brands. We were looking for potters with calloused hands, painters with turpentine-stained fingers, woodworkers with sawdust in their hair. We were looking for the kind of genuine passion that Chloe had so expertly faked. I insisted on being part of the selection committee. I read every application, looked at every portfolio, and I found them. A young woman from the city who welded sculptures from scrap metal, a furniture maker from a rural town whose hand-carved chairs were works of art, a textile artist who wove intricate tapestries on a second-hand loom in her tiny apartment. The first grant recipient was a young man named Leo. He was a woodworker, barely 22, who made exquisite handcrafted guitars in his father's garage. His application was humble, his work was breathtaking. The grant was for $5,000, a fraction of what I used to give Chloe in a single month. I drove to his town to deliver the check myself. His workshop was chilly, smelling richly of sawdust and wood varnish. Leo was shy, with kind eyes and hands that were strong and stained. When I gave him the check, he stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, this changes everything. This means I can buy that new lathe. This means I can finally quit my night job at the diner." He shook his head in disbelief. Thank you, I don't even know what to say, thank you. The gratitude in his eyes was real. It was pure and overwhelming. It was everything I had once craved from Chloe and had never received. In that moment, I understood the difference between enabling and empowering. For years, I had enabled a fantasy. Today, I was empowering a dream. I am still a 78-year-old woman. I still live in a big house filled with memories. And yes, some nights a pang of loneliness still finds me, but I am not a hag and I am not bitter. I am a patron, I am a benefactor, I am the guardian of my husband's legacy and the architect of my own. My love is no longer a blank check for the undeserving. It is a calculated, precious investment in genuine human potential. I am no longer an ATM. I am finally just Araminta Reed, and that is more than enough. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this is that true generosity requires wisdom. It is not enough to love someone, you must love them wisely. For years, I poured my love and my resources into a vessel that was not only cracked but had no bottom. I thought I was watering a flower when in fact I was just making the ground muddy. My self-respect is the most valuable asset I will ever own, and it is not for sale, and it is not to be given away freely to those who would trample on it. Love should never be a blank check.